Welcome to the second installment of a 3-part video series on Hannibal Barca featuring myself, Quill in Ink History and History House Productions. Quill has just done the first installment looking at Hannibal's early life, so go and check that out now if you haven't already. In this installment I'm going to be looking at Hannibal's campaign in Hispania and Italy, so stay tuned to the end for part 3. The fall of Saguntum sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean. Within a matter of weeks, Rome had sent envoys to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over to them to receive punishment for attacking an ally of Rome. Carthage argued that Rome had been in violation of their treaty, which stated that Roman influence was to remain to the north of the Ebro River. Rome in response simply said that the Ebro was another river entirely. With negotiations failing, Rome declared war on Carthage, and so the Second Punic War began, with one Roman army being dispatched to Hispania under the command of Scipio, another being sent to Sicily under the command of Longus. Hannibal now faced the daunting task keeping the Romans away from Carthage. He and his brothers decided the best option to take was to take the fight directly to Rome, thus denying them the chance to use Sicily as a stepping stone to attack Carthage. Before setting out, Hannibal decided to swap his somewhat unreliable Iberian troops for more reliable African troops, including his soon-to-be essential Libyan spearmen. As well as this, Hannibal gained a large number of Numidian cavalry. With these preparations, Hannibal left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of defending Hispania and set off on his journey to Rome with his brother Mago. He had 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, as well as a large detachment of elephants. Crossing the Ebro, Hannibal quickly subdued the Roman sympathizing tribes in the area and began his march towards Gaul, leaving 20,000 troops to garrison the new territories, and a further 11,000 who showed reluctance at leaving their homeland. Once there, Hannibal found himself bribing a large number of tribes for safe passage through their territory. Marching through Gaul, Hannibal came across a tribe loyal to the Romans at the Rhone River. This Gallic army, called the Caveres, had blocked the crossing over the river, directly in Hannibal's path, with their camp just behind them. Hannibal could hardly afford to delay and therefore sent a small detachment of cavalry on a huge flanking manoeuvre under the command of a man named Hanno. During this time, Hannibal began to make preparations for the crossing the river, while simultaneously keeping the Gauls fixated on his position, rather than detecting Hanno's detachment. After 3 days, Hanno arrived at the tributary of the Rhone River. Hanno sent out a signal of smoke to Hannibal, letting his commander know he was in position. Upon seeing this signal, Hannibal led a charge across the river. The Gauls responded and began shouting at the approaching army. Soon a fierce melee began, with Hannibal in the thick of the action. At this point, Hanno's detachment appeared, sending a small detachment to burn the Caveres' camp, whilst the rest of this force slammed into the flanks and rear of the enemy. The Gauls soon broke, with the entire engagement only taking a few minutes. Meanwhile, in the Greek town of Massila, the army of Publius Scipio had finally arrived and had begun to stock up on provisions for the invasion into Hispania. Scipio was stunned when his scouts accidentally bumped into Hannibal's scouts. Scipio, quickly realising Hannibal was on his way across the Alps, therefore decided to return to Italy and await the Carthaginians on the other side. Hannibal had to hurry. Winter was fast approaching, his supply lines were not secure, and elephants, needless to say, are not really meant for snow. Once in the Alps, Hannibal would find his army under near constant barrage from local tribes and hampered by the weather. Eventually, Hannibal found his road blocked by a landslide. After trying to go around the landslide unsuccessfully, Hannibal returned, set up camp and began to clear the road. Eventually, what remained of Hannibal's army finally arrived on the other side of the Alps. It had taken him from May/June to October to reach this point. Finally, he had entered Italy. Scipio had arrived via sea and had begun preparing a new army to face Hannibal. Scipio now had a new agenda, to push the invading army out of Roman territory. Scipio and Hannibal quickly found each other and had a quick cavalry skirmish, in which Scipio came off the worst, being wounded in the battle. This battle convinced many of the Gauls in the north of Italy to side with Hannibal, robbing Romans of a valuable ally. With the enemy now on home soil, Rome recalled Longus from Sicily to combine his army with that of Scipio's. Longus was eager to engage the Carthaginians, probably because his consulship was close to coming to an end. It was now December and northern Italy was blanketed in snow. Longus and Scipio set up camp on one side of the river Trebia, whilst Hannibal set up his camp a considerable distance from the river on the other side. Hannibal would send out regular detachments of Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman camp. Eventually, after one particularly daring raid, Longus, again itching to get into a battle with Hannibal, awoke with his army, and without giving them a chance for breakfast, marched them across the freezing Trebia river. Hannibal calmly prepared his army, with his cavalry on the flanks and his weaker troops in the middle. Longus, arriving on the field of battle, ordered a frontal attack straight at the weak point in the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal counter-attacked with his cavalry and elephants, quickly driving the Roman cavalry off the field. With the Roman cavalry running from the battle, the Carthaginian cavalry then turned and attacked the remaining Romans in the flanks. The Romans now only had two ways to go, backwards or forwards. Suddenly, from the marshes and tall grass to the side of the battlefield, Mago, Hannibal's brother, emerged with even more cavalry. Mago slammed into the back of the Romans, completing the encirclement. Luckily for Longus, the Romans finally pushed through the weaker troops of Hannibal's army. However, rather than turning back on the army and in turn outflanking the enemy, these Romans and Longus fled the battlefield, leaving the rest of their comrades to the victorious Carthaginians. Scipio was essentially left to clean up the mess of wounded men flooding into his camp upriver. Scipio broke camp during the night and arrived at Longus's abandoned camp. His army was still large enough that both he and Longus could not stay in the same area due to problems provisioning both armies. Scipio was spared further action from Hannibal due to a sudden cold snap, which finally killed off all but one of his elephants. When news reached Rome, the population panicked. Both consuls had been defeated by Hannibal, and many thought that Hannibal would just appear at the gates. In reality, the defeats had not been as catastrophic as the population believed. Longus still had 2.5 legions left, while Scipio still had 3, as well as another 2 that were causing havoc in Hispania against Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, meaning Rome still had 7.5 legions left to fight. Hannibal would winter his troops with the Gauls, and in the spring he began his march south. Hannibal proceeded to march over the Arno. This place was basically one huge, endless marsh. That, together with Roman harassment of his supply lines, resulted in disease and fatigue. This disease eventually affected Hannibal, who lost an eye during the march from infection. With Rome obviously being close to imminent defeat, the Republic immediately began to make plans to counter Hannibal. Longus returned to Rome, with the Senate resolving to elect new consuls. One of these consuls was Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius took over the command of Longus's army. His army then turned south to prepare the defence of Rome, which, in the Roman eye, was in imminent danger. Hannibal immediately followed Flaminius and quickly overtook him, and as a result the consul had to increase the speed of his march in order to stop Hannibal before the Carthaginians reached Rome. The other consular force was due to join up with Flaminius soon. Hannibal then attempted to lure Flaminius into battle. He did this by devastating the area Flaminius was sent to protect. As well as this, Hannibal attempted to sever the allegiances of Rome's allies in the region, by proving that Rome could simply not protect them. However, Flaminius stubbornly stayed encamped. With this, Hannibal marched around his opponent's left flank, essentially cutting Flaminius off from Rome. Hannibal then decided that he would lure Flaminius into a pitched battle. Flaminius, by this time, was sufficiently angered by Hannibal's actions, and set out to face Hannibal in battle. As Hannibal began to go around Lake Trasimene, he discovered a spot which was ideal for an ambush, and began to make preparations for the upcoming battle. To the north was a series of heavily forested hills, where the road the Romans would take passed along the north side of the lake. Hannibal camped where he was in full view of anyone entering the north defile, and spent the rest of the night arranging his troops for battle. Below his camp he placed his heavy infantry, made up of Iberians, Celts and Africans. They were also placed on a slight elevation. Hannibal then concealed his cavalry and Gallic infantry in the hills and woods along the side of the lake. He then also ordered his men to set up campfires on the hill Arturo as part of a ruse to convince the Romans the Carthaginians were further away than they actually were. With everything in place, Hannibal waited for the Romans to walk into his trap. On the morning of June 21st, the Romans marched along the road running near the northern edge of the lake, just as Hannibal had planned. Hannibal sent out a small skirmishing party to force the vanguard away from the front line. As the final Romans marched through the narrow defile, a roar of trumpets and war cries thundered down the hill, blocking the road and engaging the Romans from three sides. The Romans were taken completely by surprise and soon split into three distinct groups. The westernmost group was attacked by cavalry and forced into the lake. This left the two other groups no clear route to retreat. The centre group, which included Flaminius, stood its ground, but after 3 hours was cut down by Hannibal's Gauls. Flaminius eventually fought a Gaul called Jacarius, who eventually killed the Roman commander. Within a matter of hours, the Romans had been utterly destroyed. The Roman advance guard, however, saw very little combat, and as a result was able to fight its way out of the area. By the end of the battle, the Romans had lost around 15,000 men, with a further 15,000 being captured. Once again, Rome fell into panic. This time it was even worse than Trebia. Not only had a consul army been defeated, but a consul had actually been killed in combat. Rome elected the senator Fabius as dictator of Rome. Fabius quickly enacted the Fabian strategy, which was essentially, do not engage in a pitched battle with Hannibal, you will die. This policy greatly wounded many rich politicians' pride, and soon with the election of new consuls, Rome began to prepare to drive Hannibal out of Italy once and for all. Rome had assembled an army of 80,000 infantry and nearly 7,000 cavalry. The army was so big that it needed two commanders. Both were consuls. One was Gaius Varro, who was rash and inexperienced, and the other was Paulus, who was the exact opposite. Both men altered command of the army, with Varro favouring an aggressive stance, whilst Paulus favoured a cautious policy. On the day of the battle, the Roman army was commanded by Varro. Hannibal knew that the Romans would try to steamroll over the much smaller Carthaginian army. As a result, he positioned his army in a crescent formation, with the middle of his army being the closest to the Roman lines, with his Libyan spearmen in reserve on the flanks. Hannibal himself would fight in the front lines with his Gallic troops, inspiring his men by fighting alongside them. Varro, upon seeing this formation, immediately did what Hannibal had been expecting him to do. He attempted to steamroll the Carthaginian lines. The Romans charged en masse, losing all formation and slamming into the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal's cavalry soon proved to be superior to the Roman cavalry and easily pushed the Roman horsemen back. By this time, the Roman infantry had done exactly what they set out to do. They had pushed the patchwork Carthaginian army back, slowly sliding the front lines of Hannibal's army right past his reserve Libyan spearmen on either flank. The Libyans closed in on the flanks, and with this, Hannibal ordered his men to stop giving ground. The Roman line had been stopped in its tracks, and Hannibal's infantry began to pin them in place. Unable to escape via the flanks or the front, the Romans tried to fall back, only to be smashed into by the victorious Carthaginian cavalry. This huge Roman army was surrounded, and like a vice, the small patchwork Carthaginian army closed in on the trapped Romans. By some miracle, a young man named Scipio, the son of Publius Scipio, managed to escape the battle. The consul, Paulus, was knocked off his horse, and whilst nursing a head wound, he was killed by a hail of javelins. Varro, on the other hand, escaped, but was praised for his aggressive stance. Hannibal's victory would see him gain many allies in the Italian peninsula. However, most noticeable was the addition of Macedon into the war. The Macedonian king Philip saw an opportunity to expand into the Roman-held territory of his region. Hannibal also managed to secure an alliance with the newly appointed ruler of the Greek city-state, Syracuse. Hannibal, however, still did not have enough men to directly attack Rome, so he therefore attacked and occupied Rome's second largest city of Capua. Fabius quickly reinstated his policy of "don't fight Hannibal, you will die." The resulting stalemate saw several smaller battles, but no significant gains for the Carthaginians. However, in 212 BC, Hannibal managed to defeat 2 more consular armies, as well as killing 2 consuls in battle in 208 BC. However, these constant battles constantly drained Hannibal's resources, and as his new allies hardly gave him any support, he was left with no other option to ask Carthage for support. However, the place where he received the least support was from Carthage itself, where the politicians of the city denied Hannibal reinforcements which he desperately needed. Instead, Carthage dispatched reinforcements to Hispania, where Carthage was losing ground rapidly and was also losing resources at the same time. Eventually, Fabius' strategy of "don't fight Hannibal, you will die" began to wear Hannibal down enough that Rome could start going on the offensive. Rome attempted to retake Capua, which failed. Hannibal continued to destroy armies that were sent against him, winning victories at the Battle of Hedonia and Peltia. Hannibal, realising that he probably wasn't going to get any more support from the Carthaginian council, sent for his brother, Hasdrubal, to bring his army from Hispania and combine it with his own. Hasdrubal did this, marching over the Alps successfully and beginning to prepare for a long march to Hannibal in Italy. One day, Hannibal was encamped on his route to meet with his brother, when a small detachment of Roman cavalry appeared over the horizon. The Romans quickly threw a sack over the palisade. In the sack was the head of Hasdrubal. Hasdrubal had been caught by a Roman army and been decisively defeated in battle. With this, Hannibal's chance of taking Rome was gone. Hannibal also had a new adversary in the form of the young Scipio. Scipio, who had escaped from Cannae, managed to gain the command of an army, which had driven the Carthaginians out of Hispania. This army now threatened Carthage itself, having landed in Africa and defeated a Carthaginian army sent to repel him. Carthage desperately recalled their greatest general from Italy, after years of neglecting him. Hannibal, out of duty, probably not out of love of the politicians, returned to Carthage and began preparing the raw, inexperienced Carthaginian recruits for battle against the Romans. Hannibal then met Scipio and attempted to draw out a very rough peace treaty. However, negotiations floundered as the Romans constantly reminded the Carthaginians of their breach of the previous peace treaty. Despite the 2 generals admiring each other's military prowess, negotiations came to a close and the 2 sides prepared for battle. The 2 forces met on the plains of Zarma. Hannibal arranged his force into 3 lines, with his new, untested elephants in the front line, followed by unreliable mercenaries, which were then followed by the inexperienced raw recruits in the middle line. Hannibal's veterans from his Italian campaign made up the rear line. Scipio, on the other hand, deployed his troops in the standard Roman formation, of velites in front, followed by the Astati, Principes and Triarii. However, unlike the traditional Roman checkerboard formation, Scipio arranged his troops into columns, with his velites shielding his true formation from the Carthaginians. Scipio had also somehow managed to get the Carthaginian ally of Numidia to change sides. As a result, a majority of the Roman cavalry was the elite Numidian cavalry that caused devastation during the Roman campaign. But once, the cavalry advantage was on the side of the Romans, not Hannibal. The battle would open with an elephant charge from Hannibal. These elephants stormed their way across the battlefield. Scipio then ordered his cavalry to sound horns, hoping to scare the elephants and to make them run amok. The elephants that did run amok then slammed into the Carthaginian left. Seeing an opportunity, the Numidians launched an attack on the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal then sent his cavalry to counter this new attack. This engagement would see both cavalry leave the field, with the Numidians coming off slightly better. Hannibal's elephants then continued their charge towards the Roman lines. Here the Romans simply got out of the way of the elephants and proceeded to kill the beasts with javelins. Hannibal then advanced with his first 2 lines of infantry. The unreliable mercenaries were quickly pushed back by the Roman Hastati. However, rather than disrupt the formation of the second line, the retreating mercenaries simply moved to the flanks of the second line. This line soon engaged the enemy and began to inflict heavy losses on the Hastati. Scipio was then forced to reinforce this line with his Principes and Triarii. Soon, Hannibal had to commit his veteran line, as his second line began to falter. The more elite Roman triarii and principes began to push the flanks of Hannibal's army back. However, the veterans managed to hold their own, and for a brief moment it looked like one final push from Hannibal would see the Carthaginians victorious. Suddenly, from nowhere, the Numidians reappeared and slammed into the rear of the Carthaginian army. With this, the battle quickly turned in favour of the Romans, with Hannibal fleeing the battle in defeat. With this victory, Carthage sued for peace. The terms of the treaty were punishing for Carthage, forbidding them to make war without Rome's approval. As well as this, there was a huge war reparation to pay, which could potentially bankrupt the city. Carthage, however, quickly recovered from this economic collapse, however was never in a position to be a military power ever again. Thank you for watching and listening. Be sure to check out the finale of Hannibal's story over at History House Productions. Or if you want to find out about what happened before the outbreak of the war, check out Quill and Ink's video on the early life of Hannibal. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.